I'm speaking with Ramez Atallah. He's from Egypt, born and raised in Egypt, and for a long time has been serving as the director of the Bible Society in Egypt, a major organization that is doing significant work in Egypt. And Ramez, welcome.
Thank you, Les. Good to be here.
One of the things that we hear around the world about what's happening in Egypt is about how Christians are suffering and being persecuted in significant ways. What can you tell us about the current situation? What's happening now in Egypt?
Well, I mean, it's strange that you hear about Christians suffering in Egypt because we've had fewer terrorist incidents in the last year, let's say, than France has had, for instance. We've had hardly any. So I think when something happens in Egypt, it's magnified. We have had incidents of very tragic persecution of Christians by ISIS, either funded or motivated sources, similar to the kind of tragic events that have happened in many countries in the West. But these are just incidents. They are not the daily life of Christians. So I think the image that Christians in Egypt are a persecuted minority is very distorted and false. The richest families in Egypt are Christian families, so you wouldn't think these billionaires are being persecuted. And they run big businesses, they live their lives. Egypt is a fairly peaceable country. We've had very little violence. We don't have any gun violence or knife violence like you might have elsewhere. Christians historically have been a discriminated minority in Egypt within a majority that's not Christian. So as a discriminated against minority, they've had fewer rights than others. But as a result of this, they have struggled hard to compete with others in society. And one of the reasons we have so many very rich Christians is that they have worked harder to make wealth and gain wealth, and there's no law against that in the country. So they've succeeded phenomenally well. So about 30% of Egyptian wealth is in the hands of Christians today.
Well, it's good to hear that. And in a sense, Pope Francis, the current Pope of the Roman Catholic Church, made a significant visit to Egypt not so long ago. And we were told he was there to reassure Christians that they should have hope and they should have faith and continue in their religious faith. How significant was that?
Well, it was significant because this was an official visit. So they put out the red carpet. He was welcomed by the president, by the sheikh of the Azhar University, by the leader of the Coptic Orthodox Church and the other churches in Egypt. So this was an official visit. He was treated like the head of the Vatican State, as well as a leading Christian leader. And the closing service he had was in a military stadium, which was transformed into a church, so he could have a service there. This is very unusual. If Christians were a persecuted minority, there wouldn't be that kind of warm welcome to Pope Francis to Egypt. So I think his presence was an encouragement to all Christians and a proof again to the world of the openness of the situation in Egypt.
Right. But then you refer to Christians being a minority in religion in Egypt, and but their presence has been there a very long time. The Egyptians are very proud of the fact that they were they were the country that provided a refuge for Jesus as a baby, and the Holy Family was rescued, as it were, in Egypt. Is that continuing to be a theme among Egyptian Christians?
We're very proud of it, and there are many stories about everywhere Jesus went. Apparently, and his family visited every single monastery in Egypt before the monasteries existed. So there's lots of history about where the Holy Family was in Egypt, where they visited. And Egyptians in general, not just Christians, are proud of that, because Jesus is considered one of the prophets of Islam as well.
Right. Well, you know, we refer to the Holy Family and Jesus as a child being rescued in Egypt, and how Egyptians are very proud of that fact. And everywhere you travel in Egypt, you know, you hear stories about that. So Christianity has existed in Egypt for quite a while. How have Christians fared throughout history in Egypt?
It's been rough for Christians in Egypt, not because of themselves, but because there was under Diocletian, the emperor, there was a very ruthless persecution, and the church in Egypt, the Orthodox Church, which is the ancient church, dates its calendar from the year of the greatest persecution of Christians in Egypt, in the 3rd century AD. So that there's a real sense that Christians have suffered for their faith in Egypt. Tertullian said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, referring particularly to the church in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, you know, Egypt, part of the Middle East, part of the region of the world where Christianity emerged in the 1st century. And we know, yes, on the Russian control and the Russian Empire, the Roman Empire rather, the Christians suffered throughout the empire. How have Christians fared under persecution? What do we learn from the Bible about advice to Christians who are being persecuted in their country?
Let me go back and say that the church, the Egyptian church, having had so many martyrs over so many years, is a church that very much teaches its young people and its adults about martyrdom as being part of the calling of a Christian. Now, I don't think there are many churches in the world where young people in Sunday school, in church, adults are taught about martyrdom. So it's a church that is proud of the history of its martyrs who were willing to die instead of deny their faith. And that concept has continued over many, many years as being one of the foundation stones of the faith of Christians in Egypt. So when in recent years we've had, in 2015, these 21 Egyptian workers in Libya who were beheaded by ISIS as a way of making a statement against Egyptian Christians, the fact that they did not deny their faith, they were given the choice and decided to die faithful in Jesus rather than to live denying him. That, of course, because it was on video, we have never had a video of martyrdom. That video of martyrdom was a great testimony to the world, but also revived the concept of martyrdom within the Egyptian church. We had not had martyrs in recent history. And many people had thought that, well, martyrdom is something of the past, but no one today would be so committed in his faith that if given the choice, would prefer to die rather than deny Jesus. And when these 21 men were clearly praying to Jesus at peace, knowing that they were going to die, but knowing where they were going to go, it reminded people of the martyrdom of Stephen, who looked up to heaven and saw Jesus at the right hand of God. And they were looking up and you felt that they really had that same faith. That revived and strengthened Egyptian Christian faith. So that rather than intimidating Christians in Egypt, as the video had intended to be, it became the source of reviving, encouraging, and upholding the faith of Egyptian Christians. And then the response of Egyptian Christians, the families of the men who were killed, to that terrible act, the response in love, the response in prayers for those who did it, the response in forgiveness to those who did it, in a sense, startled the nation. It caught the attention of the people in Egypt. When the prime minister went to visit the families of these people in a village in southern Egypt, he sat on the ground with one of the mothers where she was very sad, and he was saying, you know, how do you accept this? How do you forgive? She said, Mr. Prime Minister, if my son had denied Jesus, I would have killed him myself. And that kind of faith, that kind of vision, a mother who's sad because she lost her son, but proud that in his last breath he didn't deny Jesus, was a real testimony.
Right. Well, you know, as an Egyptian Christian yourself, and as head of the Bible Society of Egypt, I would love to hear a little bit about the role of the Bible Society in the context of Egyptian society now. How is the Bible being used to strengthen and encourage and influence Christian faith in Egypt?
Well, to carry on that example, we saw that horrific video on Sunday night. By Monday morning, we worked on doing a little tract, a pamphlet about that event, and we contrasted in it the row of the Egyptian men in orange and the row of the ISIS men in black with their faces covered because they were afraid that people want to revenge, so you can see their faces. And in that little pamphlet, we contrasted, using verses from the Bible, which row is the one that that really believed in God, which row was pleasing God, which row was really victorious in the end, you know. And then we had a poem, very moving poem at the end, contrasting these two rows and saying, you know, at the end, who fears who? Those men who had faith were fearless, and yet the others were afraid. They had their faces covered. They were so afraid that someone would get to them. And so instead of intimidating Christians, as I said, it encouraged. We printed about nearly 1.5 million of these tracts and had them distributed by Wednesday all over the country. And it was a great encouragement to Christians to share for Muslims to understand the Christian's faith. It included a message of love, of forgiveness, of trust, of faith. So being present quickly in events is one of our roles. And historically, we have had some tragic events in Egypt and have tried to address them quickly as a Bible society.
Right. Well, you know, I'm sure you're aware that the matter of Christians suffering today is not unique, certainly to Egyptian Christians and so on, but this is happening all over the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and all over the world. What advice would you, as an Egyptian Christian, give to Christians suffering in the world today?
Well, I'd go back to the New Testament. And the New Testament, part and parcel of being a Christian was to suffer. Jesus said, you will be persecuted if you follow me. And if you are my disciples, you will be persecuted. So the early Christians expected persecution. When Peter and John were persecuted, were harassed by the Jewish leaders very early in the book of Acts, they left rejoicing. They were beaten. So they left rejoicing that they had the privilege of suffering for Jesus' sake. So that was an expected result of following Jesus. So all through the early church, Christians paid a heavy price to be Christians, and they didn't think it was strange. I think the danger we have now in today's church, particularly in the Western church, there is a feeling that a great value on overcoming suffering, on not suffering. So suffering is feared, it's avoided, and it's often seen as God having abandoned me. If I suffer, even if I suffer for my faith, well, it's not part of my deal with God. He's abandoned me. And people question God when they suffer. In much of the non-Western world, Christians today accept suffering as part of a price they have to pay to follow Jesus. They're not surprised by it. They're pained. They would rather not have it. But they never question that God has left them because they suffer. Because they follow the New Testament teaching that part and parcel of our message is suffering for Jesus.
Right. And they suffer for Jesus, and they do so willingly because of the theme of his own life. He was the suffering servant. He was the one who came to suffer and die. And they look upon him as an example of one who was faithful to the end. So one of the remarks, and perhaps one of the most remarkable things about the early Christians was their loyalty to Jesus, even in the midst of suffering and intimidation and persecution. They held out to the very end. And perhaps part of that is the hope that they have in Jesus. How can Christians today find real hope that through their suffering, Jesus will be there, Jesus is there, and in the end, he will triumph, and the faith will triumph?
When Paul wrote to the Philippians, he told them, you not only are called to believe in Jesus, but also to suffer for him. And these two are together. I think the testimony of people who've been tragically martyred and the response of their families shows a lot of hope. Because in Egypt recently, the families of these people had absolute conviction that their loved ones who suffered and died for Jesus were in heaven with him. And Paul says, nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. And then he goes on and makes a list of things that are related to suffering, persecution, difficulties, so on. And he ends with a sword, which means death. So he's saying even the ultimate suffering, which is ultimate persecution, which is killing someone for their faith, will not separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. So our hope as Christians is the hope of the mothers of these young men who were killed, their relatives and others who've done, is that they believe they're in a better place. And the worst that can happen to us is that we die, and dying will take us to a place where we're much better off than we are here. So in a real sense, the word martyrdom in Greek is the same word as witness in the New Testament. And the true witness was the martyr, because he proved that nothing can separate him from the love of Christ. He is with Jesus now, giving his life. So our hope does not come on the way we live, on what we do, but the hope comes from the fact that we belong to Jesus, and that if we pay the ultimate price of dying, that's not a tragedy, that's a liberation.
Right. And perhaps a final word may be said as a reminder, as an encouragement to Christians who live in parts of the world where suffering is not as prevalent, suffering for their faith is not as prevalent or common, that they're asked, they're encouraged, they are called upon to remember those who are suffering for their faith throughout the world, and to pray for Christians in the persecuted church. I believe it's the second Sunday in the month of November each year is observed as a day of prayer for the persecuted church. And this is calling the global church to remember our brothers and sisters who are suffering for their faith. Ramez Atallah, thank you very much for the time you spent with us in this conversation. Thank you.